Hello everyone, this is part 3 of my interview with Doc, a Navy Corpsman, which is basically a medic from the US Navy that is attached to US Marine units. Now in this part we will cover if Doc does carry a weapon, if he engages in combat, we talk about combat experience, about different weapons a bit, and also a bit about combat stress and how to deal with psychological issues. So let's get started. A lot of people were about combat experience, and you mentioned already earlier, to treat a patient, you have to reach fire superiority. Does this also mean you engage in combat directly, and do you carry a weapon, or is the fire superiority mission basically for the Marines?
Excellent question. And yes, I carry a weapon. I carry multiple weapons because the first part of triage is return fire. You can't wait for others to get to that firepower superiority. Everyone who can do so needs to help with that fire superiority. My preferred weapon was the M4. I preferred it much more than the M16. It was smaller, it was lighter, it was shorter. Plus, when I say return fire, if someone's more than 50 meters away, I'm probably not going to shoot at them. I mean, there's other things I can be doing, checking on the casualty as far as can I see him? Are they responsive? Can they get to cover? Can I, tell them where to get to cover? Or they're focused on firing at the enemy. Maybe I could tell them to back up while they're firing or roll over or whatever. But when the enemy's close, and of course the M4 is perfect for close quarters battle, then I preferred that. Also, I carried, the first time I went to Somalia, I was carrying a 9mm, and I think I also carried a 9 when I was doing all the UN and it wasn't really peacekeeping stuff in Africa, but basically on a walkabout about Africa. I carried a 9mm then, but when I got the choice later, after 9/11, I always carried a 45. The basic difference is the 9mm is lighter, typically could carry more rounds, but the Marine instructors summed it up for me. He said, with a 9mm, the bad guy falls towards you, and with a 45, he falls away from you. And to me, that was the epitome of it. I didn't want the bad guy falling towards me. I wanted to create distance between him and I. So I always carried a 45 after that. And of course, a knife. And I think for the whole tour in Iraq the first time, because it was with Fallujah, I had a war tomahawk. But I never had to use it as a weapon. I typically used it as a tool, but I carried it for its weapon status.
Well, that was kind of unexpected, I must say, but it makes complete sense from everything you told so far. This brings us actually to the next question. What are the most common misconceptions about your job as a combat medic corpsman? I mean, you probably know most of them from interactions with other people. Can you name a few?
Well, misconceptions as far as like the job that we do. Sometimes I had people that were surprised that I carry weapons and engage targets with those weapons. I don't find it surprising. Our first duty as medical personnel are to protect our patients. And to me, when I was with either a fire team or a squad, which is like 3 fire teams, or wherever my position was with the Marines, potentially they are all my patients. And if the protection of that patient from being wounded by a missile or a bullet is what I typically refer to as a missile, if me preventing the person from shooting that Marine also protects that potential patient. So I never had an issue with engaging targets. Yes, my reason for being there is to save lives, and I do not ever look forward to taking a life, and I wish it was possible that we never had to do that. However, my first rule was to get home to my family, no matter what I had to do to make that happen, period. Second rule is to get every Marine home to their family, no matter what I had to do to make that happen. If that means engaging targets and neutralizing them, then that's what was going to happen.
So basically, one could say a combat medic is engaged in proactive, preemptive medicine.
Definitely. I think I may steal that term from you.
Are there any other misconceptions about your job in that regard? For instance, I don't know, that people assume completely something different, or is this the main misconception that basically everyone thinks you're just running around and fixing people up?
No, and I think there's a movie now about a conscientious objector that did that in World War II, and I think that's fantastic. If that's what was needed at that time, that's great. I just don't see the practicality of doing that. Another misconception, I wouldn't call it a misconception. I'll call these misconceptions because sometimes civilians would ask me the same question, is whether we wore a red cross either on our sleeve or on our helmet. And while there are times we wore red crosses, I never wore one in combat. My mission was to look the exact same in whether it was a open sights or a scope, to look the exact same as the Marine next to me. I don't want them to be able to target me as a military person. Now, does the enemy target corpsmen or medics? I think if they could identify them, they probably would. I mean, the idea of the enemy is to hurt or neutralize as many of us as they can in a short amount of time. That's definitely our perspective, is we want to neutralize them as quickly as we can. And if that requires overwhelming firepower, then so be it. I think the Marines were fantastic at that job because they're extremely professional in how they engage targets. Luckily, the enemy wasn't as good as we were. But no, I did not wear anything that made me stand out. I mean, granted, I used to have a sidearm. A lot of times, unless you were looking from the right direction, they wouldn't see that sidearm besides the M4 that I was carrying. I think that's really it. I think that was one of the biggest questions I got, is did we wear the red crosses and stuff?
Okay, very interesting. I wouldn't have expected that neither, but it makes complete sense now. A lot of questions were about mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder. Since you're a trauma expert, I guess it is not your job in recognizing mental health issues at all. Is this correct?
Well, it's definitely not my responsibility. I don't have to report to anyone on the mental health of either the casualty or the Marines I'm working with. However, one of the things I learned from being a civilian paramedic, and I say civilian, it was a moonlighting job. As a paramedic was they had us do these like after action debriefs where we sit around just with the people who were there, and we would talk about the stressful situations that we had that day. A few times there was one run I had a SIDS baby that's extremely stressful. There's another time that children were physically abused to the point that paramedics were needed. That's a stressful situation. Automobile accidents where multiple people are either fatally injured or seriously injured. Those are stressful, and they would have us sit around and talk about it. Well, one of the things I carry with my Marines is anytime we came back from a patrol or a convoy, whether we were involved in direct action or not, we would sit around and kind of talk about it. And I would never want anyone to hear those conversations. A lot of times, to help with the stress and dealing with the stress, very off-colored jokes are made and derogatory comments, but and there's a lot of laughter about it. You wouldn't want someone else to listen to it, and those same people who said those things wouldn't say those to either civilians or people outside of the incident. However, whatever you have to do to purge that emotion, and talking about it is just an excellent way to purge that emotion from you. And the fact that you're around people who had a similar experience that aren't judging you based on what you had to do. And in combat, there's a lot of things we have to do that others have felt fear of how their loved ones or people they thought meant a lot to them, and they put a high currency price on what they thought of them. They were afraid that if they know they had done those things, they would think less of them or treat them differently. And I've seen that as well. Um, but by sitting around and talking about it, I would like to think that my Marines came out of it in a better place than maybe others.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, humor is very important to cope with psychological stress. And I read in one book that one comedian specifically said a joke consists of two parts, truth and hurt. And if a person can't acknowledge both of them, he usually can't laugh about the joke. And for most people outside of the military world, they usually neither can't acknowledge the truth nor can they acknowledge the pain in a way. So they would be completely off. I recognize the same, which is of course completely different, but with historians we can make jokes and laugh about stuff in history that was just atrocious. Most people just shockingly look at us because, well, we know the truth mostly. I mean, truth is very
Subjective, right?
yeah, subjective term, but also we have the emotional distance to a certain degree also to acknowledge the pain. And most people, they just don't want to know what is going on or what has been going on. And this is also the reason why when people have a problem with offensive jokes or something, I say, well, yeah, maybe you should see a therapist.
Exactly. One of the things that I count myself extremely lucky is finding a significant other, my spouse, who I have no doubt loves me for exactly who I am. And therefore, I tell her everything. And I don't worry about how she's going to look at me or think of me or anything like that. A lot of people don't have that same person they can turn to. And therefore, I think they bottle a lot of that stress up. Or they do have that person and just don't recognize it as that's how loving that person is, and they want to protect them from the knowledge of these bad things that happen out in the world. Much like that person that was listening to the joke and is offended, how could that, how can you even laugh at that? Well, those are the ostriches with their heads in the sand, because some people have to do very, very bad things for everyone else to be safe, not just the people around them, but people far away on distant continents to be safe. And they're better off not knowing. And so they think they're doing their loved one a service by protecting them from it, but what they're really doing is they're festering that stress inside of them. And sometimes how it gets out or manifests itself is in some type of chemical addiction, alcoholism or whatever, or violence. Or so I hope that our little sit downs after action helped my Marines